for people who have those understandings, but it's quite possible to create a society in which education becomes polytechnic, much more universal, in which people learn and become capable of doing all kinds of things. We know that children, given the proper education, can learn 3 languages, 4 languages. Our education system leaves us with 1 language and bumbling over all the other ones when we should know 3 or 4. So there's ways of reorganizing society so that everyone can not only play a collective role in decision making, but actually would have the kind of knowledge necessary to do all kinds of things in society. The thing that we have to understand about why we haven't yet had a successful revolution is because, well, we had a successful revolution. It was Russia. The main problem with the Russian Revolution, and I'll just quote Leon Trotsky, and I'll finish with this, because he describes in an excellent book how the revolution betrayed what happened to the Russian Revolution. And it wasn't this sort of any kind of innate inability of ordinary people to run society, but the strangulation and economic isolation of the revolution. He says, the revolution got no direct help from the West. Instead of expected prosperity of the country, an ominous destitution reigned. Moreover, the outstanding representatives of the working class either died in the Civil War or rose a few steps higher and broke away from the masses. And thus, after an unexampled tension of forces, hopes, and illusions, there came a long period of weariness, decline, and sheer disappointment in the results of the revolution. The ebb of the plebeian pride made room for a flood of pusillanimity and careerism. The new commanding caste rose to its place upon this wave. That is, that the rise of bureaucracy in Russia was a result of the inability of the revolution to spread, and the poverty of the revolution in its own isolation leading to the rise of bureaucracy. So Russia, in a certain sense, doesn't disprove the possibility of socialism. It merely proves what Marx said about what are the conditions that make socialism possible. It confirms it in the negative, which is, you need abundance to have a society without inequality. In Russia, you could not have a society, however hard they tried to eliminate inequality, because they were so economically impoverished as a result of the Civil War and the revolution's isolation.
So I got 2 books back there. Authors are in the crowd tonight. Ahmed Shawki's book, Black Liberation and Socialism, and Paul's book, Medium Marxism. So I'll have those back on the table after, if you guys are interested in checking that out. I can vouch for both of them. Anybody else? The last round. Okay, then we'll come back to Ahmed. Yeah. Were you yawning?
Don't answer.
So I got you.
So it's more of a comment or a prompt type thing. I heard a lot about production, and there was a comment made about boycotts and so forth. I was kind of thinking about how Marx starts capital. He starts capital and he talks about the commodity. Mm-hmm. And then he goes on and talks about going down to the secret abode of production. And I think he does that for a purpose. And this is related to sort of what Paul's talking about. You look at the social movement, one of the biggest social movements here in the United States, or at least gets the most play, it's this Tea Party movement. And I can't go back and figure out why 80% of these people aren't socialists. And I think part of this has to do with the fact that the left, and God bless Ralph Nader, but it's a sort of consumer activist sort of approach. Whereas, you use your dollar bills to boycott the things that you don't like. I don't know any rich people that shop at Walmart. And so when you say, well, don't go shop at Walmart, you're alienating this group of poor working class people. And so I think that the idea is that if you want to make social change, you begin with it at the sort of point of production. Yeah. You organize sweatshops. I've spent years trying to organize maquiladoras, not very successfully, at the San Diego Tijuana border. And I just want people, maybe you can talk a little bit about more of this as boycotting, maybe not in opposition, because I think Cesar Chavez is one of the best organizers of bringing both together, where you have strikes on the field, and then in solidarity you have boycotts of certain things. And when you put the two together, it's a powerful combination. But there's a sort of individualist, I as an individual, I'm not going to buy this, or anyway, I'll leave it at that.
I'm curious your thoughts on something like the Mondragon Corporation in Spain as a sort of example of what socialism looks like. If I'm not mistaken, I think the highest paid work, it's like a $16 billion corporation takes the whole region of Bath. They have the government control. The workers own the production. Every person has a vote. They vote in the management. If they don't like you, they will call you. In addition to that, there's also works councils. I mean, it's a very, very democratic institution. They have to be the top paid person in this multi-billion-dollar corporation, which is one of the biggest corporations in the world. It's something like which was like it's 4.5 times the lowest worker. So it's very, very democratic. I'm curious what you think of it in terms of it being a sort of Paris Commons sort of example of what we should be doing in this country and other countries.
I'm not as familiar with it as I should be, and I'll look it up when I get home, because I'm interested in that. Let me tell you a couple of things, ideas of an approach to it. First on the wage differential, 4.5 times that you said, is just so striking, just to underline that the figures in the United States in the 1970s were 40 times the top manager to the average pay of a worker in his or her employ, largely his employ, was 40 times, and that by the year 2010, depending on the statistics you see, is between 539 and 543 times what the average workers make. Okay? In Europe, by the way, the average in the 1970s was 10 times rather than 40, and has only increased, roughly speaking, 5-fold. Just to give you an idea of the massive expansion to the average managers and CEOs, for the average CEOs in the country. The problem, I think, there were a couple of similar experiments, and are still a couple of experiments like that in Britain and in a couple of other countries, Italy, and I know for a long period of time, a whole city of Porto Alegre, which had Porto Alegre in Brazil, which had a similar kind of structure, although it was over the city. Now, the problem in terms of seeing that kind of development across industry or across countries as a whole is that oasis, and it is an oasis, is subject to all the laws of the market. And so in part, I'm sure its success is in part due to the figures that you gave, which is the lack of differentials. There's such a huge drain economically is what the CEOs and the shareholders make, and that may keep it in business, but in terms of seeing that take place would require wresting control of shareholders and CEOs in the commanding heights of the economy. And that's really the problem. So that is that it works for the few thousand, the few hundred, the few thousand who work there, but is not really a plan of action for the other companies. And most of those experiments have arisen from companies that were poorly run or were going to go bankrupt, and there's some arrangement to pull them out. The arrangement in this country was different. If you think of GM, that is, the government came in, the union was forced to sign a no-strike agreement. They have very little voice in management decision, and that's the. Do you understand? So that politically speaking, such experiments are good to save a particular industry, but it seems to me keeps still intact the question: how do you wrest control, political, economic, and military, from the people who hold it now? And that it seems to me is that's the billion-dollar question. On the question of boycotts that Jose just raised, I think you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, it's a question of influence over production and how you can wrest. That's where you hurt them in the pocketbook. That's where the capitalists are at their weakest. That's where the organized working class is at its strongest. I think, however, that the combination of two tools, and sometimes, by the way, boycotts are counterposed to organizing at the point of production, either because of weakness of the union movement or for some other strategic reason.
Boycott Arizona, everybody boycott Arizona.
I mean, so yeah, but I'm in favor of that. However, I'm also in favor of industrial action, to get that to happen. On something like the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that was mentioned earlier, it's a way for us to show sympathy in much the same way as internationally sympathy was shown for South Africa under the apartheid regime. When you are not in the country itself and don't influence the point of production. There is a certain problem which is about the Israel-Palestine question, which is completely different to South Africa, which is that the bulk of Palestinians have been dispossessed and are not central to the productive process of Israel itself. If anything, in the last 15 years, where they were increasingly important in sections of the Israeli economy up until the 1980s, they've been supplanted, and really it's a process of ethnic cleansing. And so that, all I'm saying is to counterpose them can lead to certain problems, because in that case, there isn't actually even the tools at the point of production, or the workers at the point of production to organize, which was the case in South Africa, internally. So that's on that comment. I want to just end by reading something which I think is fitting to end on. It's not so I can flash this book around, but I think it was so eloquent, but raises all of the questions about socialism, about who controls what and why. And it's one of Martin Luther King's last speeches, and I thought I'd just quote from it because I think it sums up